They said I was crazy to come back. They said a widow alone couldn't matter in a judge's pocket, couldn't touch power that owned courthouses and sheriffs. 22 years I raised 3 children on a homestead while the man who murdered my husband sat in his judge's chair dispensing justice to everyone but himself. Then my youngest testified at trial. The judge's men came for her in the night. I didn't raise her to be silent. I raised her to remember. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The Sierra Nevada peaks turned crimson as sunset bled across the landscape, painting the desert in shades of copper and rust. Sarah Hawthorne stood on the porch of her homestead 50 miles east of Carson City, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. At 51, her face bore the cartography of frontier hardship, lines carved by sun, grief, and the particular exhaustion that comes from raising children alone in an unforgiving land. Her hair, once dark as raven's wings, had turned silver white almost overnight after the night riders came. The homestead was modest, 2-room adobe house, a small barn, a well that sometimes yielded water and sometimes demanded sacrifice. Behind it stretched 100 acres of rocky scrub, land that had defeated every ambition she'd harbored when she and James arrived here 30 years ago with a marriage license, a wagon, and faith that could move mountains. Faith had proven insufficient against Judge Harmon Cordell. She set the coffee cup down and reached for the letter again, crumpled now from reading, the envelope addressed in her daughter's careful hand, to the offices of the Territorial Marshal, Sacramento. Inside, 7 pages of testimony about how Judge Cordell had come to her room, how his hands had felt on her body, how he'd promised to have her father arrested for trespassing on disputed land if she resisted. Emma had been 17, too old to be called innocent, too young to understand that screaming for help would bring no one. When James had learned what happened, he'd ridden into Carson City alone. They found him 3 days later, hung in his own barn with a rope around his neck and a note pinned to his chest. Horse thief. The court had ruled it suicide. James's horse had been found at the edge of Cordell's ranch, and Cordell had witnesses swearing James had stolen it. What the court didn't mention was that Cordell's men had placed the horse there, and that Cordell's men had placed the rope. Suicide. Justice done. Move along. Sarah had raised 3 children after that, Emma, Michael, and little Thomas, on a homestead that the disputed land ruling meant she couldn't legally claim. Every year, she paid taxes on land she didn't own to a government that didn't care. Every year, she'd watched Judge Cordell's power expand, watched him use the bench to enrich himself, watched him destroy anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. And every year, she planned. The night riders had come 6 weeks ago. 20 men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath bandanas, carrying torches and ammunition. They'd taken Emma, just walked into the house and taken her, while Michael screamed, and Sarah tried to block the door with her body, a barrier as effective as fog against flood. The note they left was written in Judge Cordell's hand and signed with his seal. The girl testified falsely. Punishment follows. This is the cost of challenging justice. Emma had crawled back to the homestead 3 days later, barefoot and bruised, her eyes carrying secrets that lived in darkness. The doctors in Carson City said she'd never carry children. The law said nothing. Cordell's influence ensured the magistrate's office wouldn't file charges, that the territorial marshal wouldn't investigate, that justice would remain what it had always been, something Judge Cordell sold to the highest bidder. But Sarah had learned a hard truth during those 30 years. The law was only as powerful as people believed it to be. Cordell's power existed because the community accepted his narrative, believed his authority, allowed him to define justice, destroy belief, and the power became visible, fragile, corrupt, desperately vulnerable. So Sarah had begun gathering evidence. Patient work, meticulous work, the kind of work a woman could do without drawing attention. She'd hired lawyers from San Francisco who understood land disputes, Men who found documents proving the disputed designation had been fraudulent from the start, that Judge Cordell had fabricated the claim to steal resources. She corresponded with federal investigators, sending careful letters that led them to bank records showing Cordell had accumulated a fortune from bribes and stolen property. She'd interviewed victims, women who'd been assaulted and silenced, men who'd been robbed and intimidated, families driven from their homes by legal maneuvering. 22 years of work compressed into documents, testimony, and the kind of evidence that, once presented, couldn't be ignored, not even by a system Cordell had corrupted. And now, Sarah stood on her porch as evening descended toward night, watching the road that led toward town. Tomorrow she would ride into Carson City. Tomorrow she would present her evidence to the new territorial marshal, a man who hadn't been corrupted yet, a man who represented law unsullied by Cordell's influence. Tomorrow, possibly, the system might remember its purpose. But tonight she was terrified. The fear came from knowing what Cordell would do when he realized what was happening. He'd corrupt officials, bribe judges, deploy violence with the casual certainty of someone who'd never faced consequences. He'd try to destroy her case, her witnesses, her credibility. Most dangerously, he'd try to destroy her children. Emma had already been taken once. Michael was vulnerable on his own ranch. Little Thomas, now 22, carried a dangerous fire that made him reckless. Sarah looked toward the barn where Michael slept, and toward the horizon where Thomas had ridden that morning on business in town. Then she looked at the letter again, Emma's testimony, each word costing her something, each sentence a rebellion against silence. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. Night was falling now, shadows pooling in the rocks like dark water. Sarah went inside and began gathering what she'd collected. Documents, photographs, letters. Everything would go with her tomorrow. Everything would be presented to law that might actually matter. She didn't let herself wonder if it would be enough. Wondering was the precursor to doubt, and doubt was the precursor to paralysis. Instead, she packed carefully, deliberately, like someone preparing for a journey from which she might not return. The canyon between here and town was treacherous at night, full of washouts and hidden drop-offs that could kill a careless rider. She'd cross it in darkness, reach town by dawn, and present her case before Judge Cordell could arrange her disappearance. 3 decades. 3 decades of a woman's quiet rage, channeled into evidence, into patience, into the belief that truth, however long buried, eventually reached sunlight. Tomorrow, Sarah Hawthorne would find out if that belief meant anything at all. The federal building in Carson City stood 4 stories high, all granite and authority, built to last and designed to impress. Sarah climbed its steps at dawn, her leather satchel clutched to her chest, like it contained something sacred. In a way, it did. 22 years of documentation, compressed into paper and ink and photographs that told a story of systematic corruption that would have been darkly comic if it hadn't destroyed so many lives. The territorial marshal's offices occupied the 3rd floor. Sarah had arrived before the building was fully open, before the machinery of bureaucracy kicked to life. A clerk in rolled sleeves looked up from his coffee, slightly startled to see a woman in a widow's traveling dress standing in the entrance at such an early hour. "I need to see Marshal Webb," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind, had refined what she would say and how she would say it. "I have evidence of systematic corruption involving a territorial judge. Evidence he'll try to suppress." The clerk's expression shifted from mild boredom to something resembling interest. "Marshal Webb doesn't see people without an appointment, and particularly not women." Sarah smiled, though no humor touched her eyes. "Tell him Sarah Hawthorne is here regarding Judge Harmon Cordell. Tell him I have documentation that would interest the Attorney General. Tell him I'm not leaving until he listens or has me arrested for trespassing on public property." Something in her tone, maybe the certainty, maybe the undertone of someone who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to lose, made the clerk stand and disappear down a hallway. 20 minutes later, Sarah was sitting across from Marshal Thomas Webb. Webb was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, with a face that suggested he'd seen enough of frontier life to be skeptical of first impressions. But his eyes were intelligent, and he listened without interrupting as Sarah began laying out her evidence. Judge Cordell used fraudulent land claims to seize property worth over $300,000. She began, pulling documents from her satchel. He created fake disputed designations, then used his judicial position to rule in his favor every time. These are the original land office records. See here these dates? And here are Cordell's rulings, all from less than a week after the fraudulent claims were filed. No investigation, no inquiry, just immediate judicial validation of theft. Webb studied the documents, his expression neutral, but his attention absolute. These are forged. No, these are authentic. The forgeries were done by Cordell's man in the land office, a clerk named Gerald Paulson. I have his deposition sworn before a federal notary, admitting he fabricated dozens of claims under Cordell's direction. Where's Paulson now? Sarah's pause was answer enough. He died. Officially, a suicide, bullet to the head. Happened 3 weeks after he first expressed concern about his actions, before he could provide testimony to anyone with authority. Webb's jaw tightened. Convenient. Pattern establishing, Sarah corrected. I have 16 cases where Cordell's justice led to suspicious deaths. 12 suicides. All of them people who'd threatened to expose his crimes. For accidents, all of them equally convenient. I have affidavits from medical examiners, signed by people willing to swear that several of those deaths were murder dressed as suicide. For the next 2 hours, Sarah presented evidence. She showed how Cordell had stolen water rights from ranches, then used judicial power to force sales at fractions of value. She documented bribes disguised as legal fees. She presented testimony from his clerk, describing a ledger, never openly produced, but referenced in 16 separate cases, that itemized payoffs from wealthy parties who needed favorable judicial decisions. Most significantly, she presented Emma's testimony. Webb read it twice, his face growing colder with each page. When he finished, he looked at Sarah across the desk. Your daughter. She's willing to testify publicly. She's willing to testify to anyone who will listen. Justice might require that. But yes, she's willing. Cordell has friends. Powerful people who benefit from his corruption. Going after him won't be clean. Nothing about this has been clean, Marshal. Sarah gathered her papers. I'm not asking for a convenient investigation that disappears into filing cabinets. I'm asking for accountability. If the law can't provide that, then what's the difference between legal corruption and outright banditry? Webb was silent for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to his office window, looking out at Carson City, beginning to wake. I'll send investigators to examine these claims. But understand, Cordell will learn what's happening within hours. He has people in every government office. The moment he finds out, he'll move to suppress this evidence, discredit your witnesses, or arrange accidents for anyone who threatens him. I know, Sarah said. That's why I came in person, delivered the evidence to you directly, and made sure you understood it's all backed by federal-level documentation. Cordell can't make this disappear. He can try. I'm counting on it, Sarah replied, because every move he makes to suppress this investigation, every witness he tries to intimidate, every official he tries to bribe, that becomes additional evidence. Pattern becomes crystal clear. Webb studied her with something approaching respect. You've thought this through. I've had 22 years to think it through, Marshal. My husband was murdered to silence him. My daughter was violated to keep her quiet. My family has bled long enough. Now we bleed on the record where everyone can see. She stood to leave, but Webb stopped her. Where are you and your family going? You need protection. Once Cordell realizes. I'm going back to my homestead. My children are there. And I'm going to wait and see what a system actually does when confronted with undeniable evidence of corruption. Cordell will come for you. Good, Sarah said. Let him. When he does, let him do it where witnesses can see. Let him show exactly what kind of man justice has elevated into power. That's what happened. Cordell came for 3 days later. Not subtly, not through the courts, but directly. He rode out to her homestead with 30 armed men and a warrant, forged on official-looking paper, but written by his own hand, claiming that Sarah had filed a false report against him, that she was wanted for fraud and conspiracy to defame a government official. Sarah was waiting on her porch. She didn't resist. She didn't run. She simply allowed Cordell's men to take her, allowed herself to be bound and placed on a horse, allowed herself to be carried back toward Carson City, where Cordell intended to try her in his own courtroom and see justice served according to his personal definition. But Sarah had anticipated this. She made copies of everything, entrusted them to people Cordell couldn't touch. Lawyers in San Francisco, investigators in Sacramento, newspaper editors in 3 different cities. She'd made sure that her arrest, her appearance in Cordell's courtroom, would be documented and forwarded to people with actual authority. What Cordell didn't know was that Marshal Webb had spent the last 3 days interviewing witnesses, examining documents, and assembling a federal case that didn't depend on Sarah's testimony. What Cordell didn't understand was that his arrest of Sarah was itself evidence, proof of the intimidation, the corruption, the desperate attempt to silence investigation. As Cordell's men carried Sarah toward town and her uncertain fate, federal officers were already riding toward her homestead, and in federal offices across California. The machinery of law, real law, not the corrupted version Cordell had manufactured, was beginning to turn. Judge Harmon Cordell's courtroom occupied the entire 2nd floor of the Carson City Courthouse. It was a palace of judicial power, mahogany panels, high ceilings, galleries designed to intimidate the common folk who brought their petty disputes before the bench. Cordell presided from his elevated position like a god surveying an unworthy world, and that was precisely how he saw himself. Above law, above accountability, responsible only to the force he wielded and the people he paid to maintain it. Sarah stood before him in restraints, having been held in the county jail for 4 days, without charges being formally filed. The strategy was clear: intimidate through detention, isolate from support, then try her on whatever charges Cordell deemed convenient. The courtroom was packed, crowded with Cordell supporters and people curious to see how a widow challenged his authority. What none of them knew was that federal marshals were stationed outside the courthouse, with warrants sealed and ready. What they didn't understand was that 3 newspaper reporters sat in the gallery, documenting every moment. What they couldn't imagine was that the law, once it turned its attention to corruption, moved with surprising certainty. "Sarah Hawthorne," Cordell began, his voice carrying theatrical weight, "you stand accused of filing false reports against a territorial judge, conspiracy to commit fraud, and defamation of character. These are serious charges that strike at the very heart of law and order. How do you answer?" Sarah stood straight despite her chains, meeting his gaze directly. "I answer that every charge you filed against me is a lie designed to silence someone who has documented your crimes. I answer that you murdered my husband to maintain your power. I answer that you violated my daughter and punished her for your actions. I answer that you've spent 20 years stealing from the public, suborning perjury, and arranging the deaths of anyone who threatened your position." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Cordell's face reddened with rage. He began speaking, but was interrupted by the courtroom doors opening. Federal marshals entered, moving with the precision of men following direct orders. Behind them came Marshal Webb and 2 federal investigators. "This court is now under federal investigation," Webb announced. His voice carried the absolute authority of law that transcended local corruption. "All proceedings are suspended pending a comprehensive review of judicial conduct and potential criminal activity." Cordell rose from his bench, his face twisting with fury and something that might have been fear. "You have no authority here. This is a territorial matter under my jurisdiction." "Your jurisdiction," Webb interrupted coldly, "has been suspended pending investigation. Federal law supersedes territorial authority when evidence suggests systematic abuse. You're to remain in custody pending hearing before the Federal Circuit Court in San Francisco." The courtroom descended into controlled chaos. Cordell's supporters began filing out or stepping forward in confusion. The reporters began writing furiously, and Sarah, watching from her position at the defense table, felt something release in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but the exhaling of pressure that had built over 22 years. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Webb said, approaching her, "federal custody is removing your chains. You're a witness in an ongoing investigation, not a criminal. And for what it's worth, everything you documented has been corroborated by independent investigation. Every major charge stands." Sarah looked at Cordell being led away by federal marshals, watched as the man who'd held her life hostage through fear and corruption was reduced to a prisoner. But she felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing the system, when it actually functioned, deliver what it promised. "What happens to the witnesses?" she asked. "The women who testified about his violations?" "Protection. Federal protection. And if any of them want to press charges outside this investigation, they can. But Cordell will face justice before that becomes necessary." Sarah nodded. Then she turned to the courtroom gallery and saw her children, Emma, Michael, and Thomas, watching from where they'd been hidden for protection during the proceedings. She moved toward them, and the chains that had symbolically bound her were finally removed. Justice was not perfect. The system was not pure. But sometimes, when confronted with undeniable evidence and unrelenting pressure, it remembered its purpose. Sometimes the law could protect the powerless from those who wielded authority as a weapon. The trial lasted 4 months. It unfolded in the federal courthouse in San Francisco before a judge carefully selected for his reputation as incorruptible. Judge Randall Williams was 73 years old, had served for 50 years, and had never been successfully bribed or intimidated. He was precisely the kind of authority Cordell's corrupted power couldn't reach. Sarah testified for 3 days, walking the court through 22 years of documentation. She presented letters, deeds, financial records, a tapestry of evidence that showed systematic theft and abuse woven through Cordell's entire judicial career. Her voice never wavered, her facts never contradicted, her certainty never flickered. Emma testified on the 4th day, and her testimony was the pivot point where abstract corruption became personal tragedy. She described that night, described Cordell's hands and his threats, described the calculation in his eyes when he explained what would happen if she told anyone. She described walking back to the homestead barefoot and bleeding, carrying a violation that would reshape her life forever. By the time Emma finished, there wasn't a person in the courtroom who didn't understand what Cordell had done, what he represented, what the cost of his power had been for those who couldn't match it. Michael testified about finding his sister, about the rage he'd had to swallow when told the law would do nothing, about the long years of watching his mother gather evidence while their attacker remained free to damage more lives. Thomas testified about the night riders, about watching federal marshals arrest his mother and knowing that her attempt to seek justice had put her in danger. And witness after witness came forward, women who'd been assaulted and silenced, men who'd been robbed and intimidated, families driven from their homes. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of systematic corruption that made Judge Cordell look less like a judge and more like a criminal operating within the framework of law. Cordell's defense was desperate and transparent. His lawyer argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that correlation wasn't causation, that political enemies had conspired to discredit him. But the defense crumbled against the weight of documented proof. Nobody could explain away a decade of forged land claims. Nobody could explain the deaths. Nobody could explain why 17 different people came forward with nearly identical stories of extortion and abuse. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found Cordell guilty on 19 separate counts: corruption, fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and sexual assault under color of authority. The sentence was life imprisonment in San Quentin. When Judge Williams read the verdict, the courtroom remained silent for a full minute. Then Sarah began to weep, not tears of triumph, but the deep, wrenching release of someone who'd finally set down a burden carried too long. That evening, she stood on the courthouse steps while reporters called questions. She'd been asked to speak, to offer some commentary on the verdict, some wisdom about the nature of justice and law. "What I learned," Sarah told them, "is that the law doesn't protect the powerless, people do. It doesn't ensure justice, evidence does. But people gathering evidence, documenting corruption, refusing to accept that silence is the only option, that's how the system changes. Not overnight, not without cost, but it changes because individuals decide it matters more to speak than to stay safe." She looked at Emma standing beside her, at Michael and Thomas, flanking them like guardians. "My husband died to protect his honor. My daughter was violated to maintain someone's power. And I spent 22 years gathering evidence when I could have been living. We paid a price to prove what needed proving. But maybe, somewhere, another woman won't have to pay that same price because Cordell goes to prison instead of remaining free to destroy." Cordell's trial became a blueprint. Within 6 months, federal investigators had opened 22 separate investigations into other territorial judges suspected of similar corruption. 3 judges resigned before charges could be filed. 2 committed suicide, a pathetic final display of the cowardice that had always driven them. 3 more faced trials. The impact on the judicial system was seismic. Standards were established. Oversight committees were created. Procedures for handling corruption became formalized. The message was clear. Judges could no longer assume that their position granted immunity from accountability. And Sarah became something she'd never anticipated, a symbol. Women who'd been violated came forward with their stories. Men who'd been robbed by legal corruption began seeking justice. The silence that had protected predators began to break. Sarah never wanted to be a symbol. She wanted to return to her homestead, to raise her remaining family, to live quietly. But that was impossible. She was asked to speak in Sacramento, to consult with officials crafting new laws, to advise other women gathering evidence against judicial corruption. She did these things because the cost of not doing them, the knowledge that another Sarah might spend 22 years gathering documentation while her attackers remained free, was unacceptable. Emma slowly began to rebuild. She'd never marry, never have children as she'd dreamed. But she became a paralegal in a law firm dedicated to defending women against exploitation. Michael expanded the homestead, invested in cattle, built something tangible from the wreckage of their family's history. Thomas became a constable, dedicated himself to enforcing law that actually protected the weak. Sarah lived to see Cordell die in San Quentin, killed in a fight by other inmates who'd learned who he was and what he'd done. She lived to see the federal judicial system strengthen and improve. She lived to see other women use the blueprint she created, the careful documentation, the patient gathering of evidence, the willingness to face public scrutiny and private violation in service of something larger than personal safety. When Sarah died at 83, the San Francisco Chronicle ran an editorial that called her the woman who reformed Western justice. She would have objected to the characterization. She'd simply done what needed doing, had gathered evidence when she could have gathered nothing, had chosen silence as alternative when silence had seemed the safer path. 40 years after Judge Cordell's conviction, a new building was dedicated in Carson City. It housed the first official federal courthouse west of the Mississippi, built with explicit mandate to eliminate local corruption by removing judicial authority from territorial control. The building's dedication plaque bore Sarah Hawthorne's name, not because she'd been a politician or official, but because she'd been a woman who decided that evidence mattered more than safety, that truth mattered more than comfort, that the cost of standing witness was worth paying. Emma attended the dedication, now 50 years old, but still carrying the particular dignity that comes from surviving violation and refusing to be defined by it. Michael came with his children and grandchildren. Thomas brought his own family. They stood together as the plaque was unveiled, and Emma began to weep, not for what had been lost, but for what had been found in the aftermath of loss. A young woman approached them afterward. She introduced herself as a journalist researching women who challenged corruption through documentation and evidence. She asked Emma about that night, about the aftermath, about what her mother's determination had cost. Emma was quiet for a long moment before answering. My mother taught me that the law doesn't care about victims unless victims make themselves visible. That evidence matters more than authority. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. She also taught me that the cost of standing witness is real. I can't have children. I still wake sometimes from nightmares. I'll never be entirely whole. But thousands of women since then have found protection through legal systems that changed because my mother insisted that documents matter and evidence speaks. She paused, then added, I'd say that was worth the cost. Not because I was compensated, I wasn't. Not because the system became perfect, it didn't. But because it became a little less willing to excuse corruption. And in the West, where men have ruled without accountability for generations, that small shift toward justice is actually revolutionary. The journalist asked to photograph Emma, standing beside the plaque bearing her mother's name. Emma agreed, but asked that her siblings stand with her. The resulting photograph ran in newspapers across the country. 3 middle-aged people flanking a plaque that read, Sarah Hawthorne, who proved that evidence defeats corruption, that persistence overcomes power, and that women can reform justice when they decide the cost is worth paying. That photograph became iconic. It represented something that the frontier West had struggled to achieve, the notion that power could be challenged, that corruption could be proven, that a single woman's courage could reshape institutions larger than herself. And in small towns across the territories, other women read about Sarah and began gathering their own evidence. They documented assaults, recorded threats, preserved proof of corruption. Some saw their attackers prosecuted. Others learned the system's limits, but learned them as documented facts rather than accepted silence. But all of them could point to Sarah Hawthorne's example and understand that speaking, documenting, and pursuing truth mattered, even when victory was incomplete, even when justice was imperfect, even when the cost was high. That was Sarah's true legacy. Not the trial, not the conviction, not the institutional reform, though those mattered. Her true legacy was the understanding that silence is a choice, that evidence is a weapon available to the powerless, that a woman's determination to document corruption can reform systems built by men who believed themselves beyond accountability. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.